I always loved the thrill of exploring abandoned places. There's something eerie yet exciting about stepping into the unknown, a place frozen in time, left to decay. But not every adventure goes as planned, and sometimes you find things that should have stayed hidden. This story happened last summer. My friends and I had been planning a weekend trip to explore forgotten spots in our area. We weren't professionals, just thrill seekers armed with flashlights, cameras, and a knack for getting into places we shouldn't. It was all fun and games until we stumbled upon the amusement park. We didn't even know it existed. The map showed nothing but forest for miles. Yet, as we hiked deeper into the woods, we saw the towering silhouette of a Ferris wheel peeking through the trees. It was like something out of a dream or a nightmare. "Do you guys see that?" my friend Jake whispered, breaking the silence. We stopped in our tracks, staring at the rusty skeletal structure. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the metal a dull reddish brown. Vines snaked their way up the frame, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim it. But the strangest part, it was dead silent. Not even the birds chirped. Something about the place felt wrong, but we were too curious to turn back.
As we approached the gates, the eerie feeling only grew stronger. The entrance was wide open, the once bright sign above now just a skeleton of rusted metal. Faint letters spelled out Dreamland Park, but most of it had fallen off, leaving the name fractured and unreadable. Jake was the first to step inside, his flashlight cutting through the dense, stale air. "Looks like no one's been here for decades," he muttered, kicking an old soda can that clinked loudly against the cracked pavement. I followed close behind, my camera in hand. The first thing that struck me was the smell. A mix of damp earth, mildew, and something metallic, like blood. It was faint but unmistakable, lingering in the air like a warning. The main path led to a cluster of attractions. There was a carousel, its once colorful horses now faded and chipped, their hollow eyes staring blankly into the void. To the left, a row of game booths stood in various states of decay, their prizes, stuffed animals, plastic toys, still hanging by threads, rotted and discolored. Then we saw the Ferris wheel up close. It towered over everything else, its skeletal frame swaying slightly in the breeze. That's when I noticed something odd. One of the gondolas was moving. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Did you see that?" I whispered to the group. "See what?" Jake asked, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. I pointed to the Ferris wheel, but by then the gondola was still. Maybe it was the wind, I thought. Or at least that's what I told myself. We decided to keep moving. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the park became. The silence was deafening. No rustling leaves, no distant animals, just our footsteps crunching against broken glass and debris. "Check this out," Sarah, the most cautious of us, called out. She was standing near a ticket booth, her flashlight focused on something scratched into the glass. It was a word, jagged and uneven, as if carved in desperation. "Leave." "Probably just some kids messing around," Jake said, forcing a chuckle. But none of us were convinced. The scratches were deep, too precise. Whoever left that message wasn't joking. We pressed on, stepping into what looked like the food court. Tables were overturned, rusted soda machines leaned precariously, and shattered dishes littered the ground. I knelt down to examine a menu board when I saw it. Footprints. They weren't ours. The prints were faint but fresh, leading away from the food court and disappearing into a darkened tunnel labeled Funhouse. My stomach churned as I stood there staring at the path. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but something about the footprints pulled me in, like I had to know who or what had made them. "That's enough exploring for me," Sarah said suddenly, her voice shaking. "We should go." Jake hesitated, torn between adventure and common sense. "It's probably just someone else exploring," he reasoned. "Let's check it out and leave. 5 minutes, tops." Against my better judgment, I followed. The footprints led us closer to the tunnel, and that's when we heard it, the faint sound of laughter. Not the cheerful kind you'd expect from a theme park. This was different. Hollow, distorted, echoing through the empty park like a broken record. We all stopped, exchanging uneasy glances. The laughter grew louder, and then it stopped. The entrance to the funhouse loomed before us, its faded paint and shattered lights barely hinting at the joy it once promised. The word funhouse hung above, with the F dangling precariously. I hesitated at the doorway, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, and carried a sour odor. My instincts screamed to stay outside, but Jake pushed forward. "Come on," he said, forcing a grin. "What's the worst that could happen?" Sarah stayed back, muttering about keeping watch. I envied her caution but didn't want to seem afraid, so I followed Jake inside. The floor creaked beneath our feet. The walls were lined with cracked mirrors, each distorting our reflections. My reflection looked wrong, stretched in ways that didn't match the angles of the glass. My stomach churned. Then came the sound. Faint at first, like soft tapping, but it grew louder with each step. It echoed, bouncing off the walls, coming from everywhere at once. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Jake nodded, his bravado fading. "Probably rats," he muttered, though his voice cracked. The tapping turned into footsteps, slow, deliberate, too heavy to belong to an animal. They came from deeper inside, past the mirrors. Jake's face turned pale. "We should head back," he said. Before I could answer, the lights flickered. For a split second, the funhouse was bathed in sickly yellow light, and I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the corridor. It didn't move, but his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it was watching us. And then the lights went out. For a moment, the darkness was absolute. I couldn't even see Jake, though I could hear his panicked breathing just a few steps away. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst out of my chest. "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Yeah," he replied, his voice barely audible. "I'm here." What the hell was that? Before I could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed again, louder this time. They weren't coming toward us, they were circling us. My flashlight flickered as I turned it on, its weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive blackness. When the light steadied, it revealed the mirrors again, but something was wrong. Our reflections weren't moving. Jake and I were frozen in place, but in the mirrors, our distorted doppelgangers stared back at us grinning. "Jake!" I managed to choke out, pointing at the mirrors. "I see it," he muttered, his voice shaky. "This isn't real, it's just some kind of trick, right? It's got to be." But deep down I knew it wasn't a trick. The grinning reflections moved on their own, their heads tilting in perfect unison, mirroring the figure we'd seen earlier. And then one of them stepped out of the mirror. It didn't make a sound as it moved, its twisted body jerking unnaturally with each step. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment I thought it would go out completely. The figure stopped a few feet from us, its face an impossibly stretched version of mine. "Run," Jake whispered, grabbing my arm. But before we could move, the mirrors shattered in unison, sending shards of glass raining down around us. The sound was deafening, and the last thing I saw before the light finally died was the figure lunging toward us. When I opened my eyes, I was on the floor. My flashlight was gone, leaving us in near total darkness. The air was filled with a choking dust, and my ears rang from the sound of the mirrors shattering. For a moment, I thought I was alone. "Jake!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," he groaned from somewhere to my left. "Are you okay?" I nodded, then realized he couldn't see me. "Yeah, I think so. What was that thing?" Jake didn't answer. Instead, I heard him scrambling to his feet. I reached out blindly, my hands brushing against shards of broken glass. Then, out of the silence, came the laughter again. It was closer this time. No longer distorted. It sounded human. But there was something wrong with it, like it was coming from multiple throats at once. My skin crawled as I realized it was echoing from all around us, bouncing off the jagged walls of the funhouse. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Now!" We stumbled forward, guided only by the faint glow of an emergency exit sign flickering in the distance. Every step felt like a lifetime, the floor groaning beneath our weight. The laughter followed us, growing louder, more frantic. Then we saw it, a mural painted on the wall just before the exit. It was faded and cracked, but the image was unmistakable. It showed the same distorted figure we had seen earlier, surrounded by children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. At the bottom of the mural were the words, "Dreamland welcomes you forever." My stomach churned, and Jake swore under his breath. The laughter was deafening now, as if the walls themselves were mocking us. I reached for the exit door, praying it wasn't locked. When my hand touched the handle, the laughter stopped. Everything went silent. I froze, my hand on the door handle. The sudden silence was worse than the laughter. Jake stood behind me, breathing heavily. "Open it," he hissed. I turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something held it shut from the other side. I yanked harder, panic surging. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound on the metal, like fingernails dragging slowly. Jake's flashlight flickered as he pointed it at the mural. "It's different." I turned to look. The mural, cracked moments ago, was now vivid. The children's hollow eyes seemed to follow us, their smiles wider. The figure in the center wasn't painted anymore. It stood in front of the wall, tilting its head at that unnatural angle, staring. "Run!" Jake shouted, pulling my arm. We bolted down the corridor. The air grew colder, and the laughter returned, louder, angrier, overlapping in a cacophony of madness. The presence behind us felt suffocating, but I didn't look back. All I could think about was escaping. We burst through the entrance, gasping for air in the overgrown park. Sarah was gone. Her flashlight lay on the ground, its weak beam flickering. "Sarah!" I screamed, my voice echoing. No response. Just the wind rustling the trees. Jake grabbed my arm. "We have to go, now." Reluctantly, I followed. My legs trembled as we ran back to the forest path. At the edge, I looked back one last time. The funhouse was gone. In its place was an open field, silent and empty, as if the park had never existed. It's been months since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that we left something behind. Or maybe something followed us. Jake refuses to talk about it. We agreed never to mention the park again, not even to Sarah's family. How could we explain what happened? What could we even say? She was just gone. But every now and then, I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sound of that laughter echoing in my ears. I've tried convincing myself it was just a bad dream, that none of it was real. But then I'll see them, the footprints. They appear outside my window, faint yet unmistakable, like someone or something is watching, waiting. Last week I found a piece of glass on my bedroom floor, sharp and jagged. It looked like it came from a mirror. But the strangest part? When I picked it up, I could see something moving in its reflection. Not me, something else, something grinning. Now, I keep my curtains closed, and every mirror in my house is covered. But I can't help wondering, what if that park isn't gone? What if it's just waiting for its next visitors? When I moved into the apartment, I thought it would be a fresh start. It was an old building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't think much of it. I was just happy to finally have a place of my own. The first few days were uneventful. The apartment was small but cozy, with creaky wooden floors and tall windows that let in just enough light during the day. At night, though, it felt different. The shadows seemed to linger longer, stretching across the walls in strange shapes. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of moving into a new place. But then I started noticing things, little things that didn't make sense. The bathroom door would be slightly open when I knew I'd closed it. Lights I had turned off would flicker back on. And once, I found my keys in the fridge, though I was sure I'd left them on the counter. "It's just the stress," I muttered to myself, trying to laugh it off. But deep down, I felt uneasy. The apartment felt lived in, like I wasn't alone. And then came the dreams. Every night I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing. I couldn't remember the details, only fragments. A figure standing in the corner of my room, watching me. Always watching. One night I woke up and realized something. The figure wasn't in my dream. It was real. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the street lamp outside. But in the corner where the light didn't quite reach, there it was, a figure standing perfectly still. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its head was tilted slightly, as if observing me. I couldn't see its face, only the outline of its form blending into the shadows. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, fumbling in the dark. When I turned back, it was gone. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just a nightmare. I'd been under a lot of stress lately, after all. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. A few days later, I decided to tell my neighbor about it. She was an older woman who had lived in the building for decades. Her face grew pale when I described what I'd seen. "You've seen him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Seen who?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "The man in the shadows," she said, crossing herself. "He's been here as long as I can remember. Some say he's just a story, a warning to keep the kids from wandering into the basement. But others..." Her voice trailed off and she looked away. "Others what?" I pressed. She hesitated before answering. "Others say he only appears to those he's chosen." Chosen for what? I didn't want to know. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt amplified, like the apartment itself was alive. I left the lights on, hoping it would keep the shadows at bay, but it didn't help. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, staring at the wall as the sound grew louder. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a rat or some old pipes. But then I heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from inside the room. I turned my head slowly toward the corner where I'd seen the figure before. It was there again, standing perfectly still, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. My breath caught as I realized something I hadn't noticed before. Its shadow wasn't cast by the light. It existed independently, darker and deeper than anything else in the room. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For the first time, it moved. Its head snapped upright, and its long, spindly arm raised to point at the door. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my phone and bolted out of the apartment, not stopping until I was outside in the freezing night air. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. When I finally looked back at my window, I saw it, his face, pressed against the glass, grinning. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of his face in the window. It wasn't human, not entirely. The grin was too wide, the teeth too sharp, and the eyes, they were just empty voids. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment, not until I figured out what was going on. I went back to my neighbor, hoping she could tell me more about the man in the shadows. She seemed reluctant to talk, but finally gave in when I pressed her. "They say he's part of this building," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid he might hear. "The original owner built it in the 1920s. He was a recluse, never left the property. Some say he dabbled in dark things, rituals, sacrifices. When he disappeared, no one asked questions. But people who've lived here long enough, they've seen him." I stared at her, chills running down my spine. "What does he want?" "No one knows," she replied. "But if you've seen him, it's already too late. He doesn't just haunt this building. He marks people. He'll follow you." Her words sent a wave of cold dread through me. I left her apartment, determined to find answers. I spent the rest of the day researching the building's history at the local library. What I found made my blood run cold. The owner's name was Edward Thorne. He disappeared in 1928 under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a series of journals. One of them had been archived by the city and was filled with strange drawings and symbols. In every sketch there was the same figure, tall, thin, and grinning from the shadows. Scrawled across the last page were the words, "He is the shadow, he is always watching." I didn't go back to the apartment that night. Instead, I stayed at a cheap motel. The journal pages burned into my mind. I barely slept, every noise outside my room making me jump. But no matter how far I tried to run from it, I knew I couldn't escape him. The next evening, against every instinct, I returned to the apartment. I had to face him, to end this somehow. Armed with a flashlight and a desperate plan, I stepped inside. The air was colder than ever, the silence oppressive. Edward Thorne, I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. If you're here, I know what you did. I know who you are. For a moment, nothing happened. Then from the shadows, his voice came, a deep, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. You don't belong here. The lights flickered, and there he was, standing in the corner, his grin wider than ever, his long arms stretched out, the shadow of his figure growing larger and larger until it filled the room. What do you want from me? I shouted, backing away. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. That's when I saw it, the symbol from the journal, carved faintly into the wooden floor beneath me. In a flash of desperation, I pulled out my phone and used the journal's photo as a guide, completing the symbol with my finger. As soon as the last line connected, the room exploded with light. A deafening scream echoed through the apartment as his shadow writhed and twisted, shrinking back into the corner, and then he was gone. I moved out the next day. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. But even now, weeks later, I still don't feel safe. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up and feel that same cold air, that same heavy silence. And sometimes, I swear I can see his shadow at the edge of my bedroom. If you ever find yourself in an old building, take my advice. Don't look too long into the shadows. You might not like what you see.